Every daycare has one child the teachers quietly worry about. At Little Oaks Daycare, that child was Sophie. She was only 2 years old. She loved strawberry yogurt, carried a small brown teddy bear everywhere she went, and had the kind of smile that made strangers smile back without even realizing it. But despite her sweet face and gentle personality, there was one thing every teacher seemed to agree on. Sophie simply couldn't follow directions. Every morning, the children gathered on a colorful rug for story time. 20 tiny faces would sit cross-legged, listening carefully as Miss Carter read books about talking animals, brave firefighters, and magical adventures. For the first minute or two, Sophie always sat with everyone else. She hugged her teddy bear close to her chest, watched the pictures with wide, curious eyes, and seemed completely interested in the story. Then, almost like clockwork, she would quietly stand up. She never asked permission. She never said where she was going. She simply walked away. "Sophie," Miss Carter would call softly. The little girl would stop, look back with an innocent smile, then continue walking as though she hadn't heard a word. The other children started noticing. "There goes Sophie again," one little boy whispered. "My mommy says she never listens," another child said during lunch one afternoon. Miss Carter always brought Sophie back without raising her voice, but inside, she couldn't hide her frustration. She had worked with toddlers for nearly 15 years. Most children tested boundaries. Some cried when they missed their parents. Others refused to share toys. But Sophie was different. She wasn't angry. She wasn't stubborn. She wasn't trying to cause trouble. She simply kept leaving. No one could understand why. Every afternoon, the teachers filled out small observation reports about each child. Most of the reports were filled with cheerful notes. Emma counted to 10 today. Lucas shared his toys without being asked. Noah finished all his lunch. But Sophie's reports looked very different. Left story time without permission. Walked away during snack time. Ignored teacher instructions. Separated from the group during outdoor play. By the end of the week, Sophie's file had become thicker than anyone else's. Mrs. Wilson, the daycare director, stared at the growing stack of papers on her desk and rubbed her forehead. "This isn't getting better," she said quietly. Across the room, 2 teachers nodded. "It's happening every single day," one replied. "We've tried reminders, we've tried praise, we've tried redirecting her. Nothing changes." Mrs. Wilson looked down at another report before placing it neatly on top of the pile. "We have to think about the safety of the other children too." The room became quiet. No one enjoyed conversations like these. Little Oaks wasn't the kind of daycare that gave up on children. They believed every child deserved patience, every child deserved understanding, but they also had rules. And those rules existed for a reason. One child wandering away could quickly become 20 children wandering away. The teachers couldn't ignore it forever. That Monday morning began like every other. Parents hurried through the front doors carrying tiny backpacks and colorful lunchboxes. Children laughed as they raced toward their favorite toys. Some hugged their parents goodbye without looking back. Others cried until a teacher gently picked them up. Then Sophie arrived. She walked through the front door holding her father's hand with one hand and her teddy bear with the other. "Good morning, Miss Carter," her father said with a warm smile. "Morning, Mr. Thompson," Miss Carter replied. She knelt beside Sophie. "Ready for another fun day?" Sophie smiled. Then she held up Mr. Teddy. "Teddy ready." Miss Carter couldn't help smiling back. She truly liked Sophie. Everyone did. That was what made everything so confusing. How could such a sweet little girl create so many problems? A few minutes later, story time began. The children gathered on the rug while Miss Carter opened a brightly colored picture book. Today's story was about a baby duck searching for its family. The classroom grew quiet. Even the most energetic toddlers leaned forward to look at the pictures. Sophie sat near the front, hugging Mr. Teddy tightly. For nearly 2 minutes, she didn't move. Miss Carter relaxed. Maybe today would be different. She turned another page. The little duck had become lost in a forest. The children watched carefully. Then, Sophie stood up. Without making a sound, she began walking toward the back of the classroom. Miss Carter sighed. Not again. She carefully placed the book face down. Everyone stay seated. Then she followed Sophie. The little girl wasn't running. She wasn't laughing. She wasn't trying to hide. She simply walked toward the reading shelf at the back of the room. When Miss Carter reached her, she noticed Sophie wasn't looking at the toys. She was looking past them, toward the quiet corner near the window. "Sweetie," Miss Carter said gently, "what are you doing?" Instead of answering, Sophie pointed with one tiny finger. Miss Carter looked in the same direction. She frowned. There was nothing there, just a beanbag chair, a bookshelf, and sunlight shining through the window. "I don't see anything." She picked Sophie up and carried her back to the rug. The story continued. Another note would later be added to Sophie's file. After story time came art class. The children dipped paintbrushes into bright colors and covered sheets of paper with messy little masterpieces. Some painted rainbows. Others painted dinosaurs. One little boy somehow painted his own elbow bright purple. The teachers laughed. Everything felt normal, until Miss Carter looked around the room. One chair was empty. Sophie had disappeared again. She immediately stood up. "Stay where you are, everyone." The teachers searched the classroom, then the hallway. Finally, Miss Carter found Sophie standing just outside the toddler room. She wasn't playing, she wasn't touching anything, she was simply standing there, looking through the small glass window in the door. "What are you doing out here?" Miss Carter asked. Sophie pointed again. Inside the toddler room, a younger little girl had dropped her stuffed bunny behind a shelf. She was crying quietly, while another teacher tried to comfort her. Before Miss Carter could say anything, the teacher inside found the bunny and handed it back. The little girl immediately stopped crying. Sophie smiled. Then she turned and reached for Miss Carter's hand, as if nothing unusual had happened. Miss Carter stared at her for a moment. A strange feeling settled in her chest. It wasn't the first time Sophie had pointed towards something before anyone else noticed it. But every time Miss Carter looked, she always seemed to be a few seconds too late. She gently took Sophie's hand and walked her back to class. Neither of them noticed Mrs. Wilson standing at the end of the hallway, clipboard in hand, watching the entire thing. She quietly wrote another note. Left classroom without permission. By lunchtime, the incident had already become the third report of the day. As Mrs. Wilson closed Sophie's folder that afternoon, she let out a slow breath. "I think we've reached the point where we need to have a difficult conversation with her parents." Miss Carter looked down at the reports scattered across the desk. Something about them bothered her, not because they were untrue. Every report accurately described what Sophie had done, but somehow they didn't tell the whole story. And for reasons she couldn't yet explain, Miss Carter couldn't shake the feeling that everyone was missing something. She just didn't know what it was. The rest of the afternoon passed quietly, but Miss Carter couldn't stop thinking about Sophie. She had read every report in the girl's file. Not one of them was false. Every report described exactly what Sophie had done. She left her seat. She wandered away. She ignored instructions. She separated herself from the group. Everything was accurate, yet somehow, none of it explained why. That single question followed Miss Carter home that evening. Why? The next morning, she arrived at the daycare earlier than usual. The classrooms were still empty. The smell of fresh coffee drifted from the teacher's lounge, while the janitor vacuumed the hallway. Miss Carter unlocked her classroom and began arranging tiny chairs around the reading rug. A few minutes later, Mrs. Wilson walked in carrying Sophie's folder. "I spoke with the owners yesterday," she said. Miss Carter looked up. "They're concerned. I understand. They asked me to observe Sophie one last time this week, before making a final decision." Miss Carter nodded. "I think that's fair." Mrs. Wilson placed the folder on the shelf. "I'll be in your classroom most of the morning." Miss Carter smiled politely, but inside she felt nervous. Not because she disagreed with the director, because she still couldn't explain the feeling she had every time she watched Sophie. It was almost as if she was reading only half of the story. Parents soon began arriving. One by one, the children filled the classroom with laughter. Then Sophie walked in. She wore a tiny yellow sweater decorated with little white flowers. Mr. Teddy was tucked safely under her arm. "Good morning, Sophie," Miss Carter said. The little girl smiled. "Morning?" Mrs. Wilson watched quietly from the corner of the room. She had already opened her notebook. Today's observations had begun. The morning started smoothly. The children stacked colorful blocks. They built towers, pretended they were castles, pretended they were rockets. Everything felt peaceful. Then a loud crash echoed across the room. Lucas had accidentally knocked over Noah's tower. Before either teacher could react, Noah burst into tears. Miss Carter walked toward him. But she wasn't the first person to arrive. Sophie was already there. She gently picked up one of the fallen blocks and handed it to Noah. Then another. Then another. Noah slowly stopped crying. Miss Carter smiled. Mrs. Wilson wrote something in her notebook. Miss Carter couldn't see what it said. Later that morning, the children lined up to wash their hands before snack time. One by one, they waited patiently. Sophie stood near the back of the line. Everything seemed perfectly normal. Until she quietly stepped out of line. Mrs. Wilson noticed immediately. "There she goes again," she whispered. Sophie didn't run. She didn't look mischievous. She simply walked toward the cubbies, where the children's backpacks were stored. Mrs. Wilson sighed and followed her. "Sophie." The little girl stopped, then pointed toward one of the cubbies. Mrs. Wilson frowned. "What is it?" She looked closer. Nothing. Just tiny backpacks hanging neatly in place. She looked back at Sophie. "Come on." As she reached for Sophie's hand, she heard a strange sound. Drip, drip, drip. She looked up again. A water bottle inside one backpack hadn't been closed properly. Water had already begun leaking onto the floor. Only a few more seconds, and another child running through the hallway would have slipped. Mrs. Wilson quickly grabbed paper towels. She cleaned the puddle before anyone else noticed. When she looked back, Sophie was already walking toward the snack tables. Mrs. Wilson stared at her for a long moment. She didn't write anything in her notebook. Snack time arrived. Tiny cups of apple juice, cheese cubes, crackers. The children chatted happily. Mrs. Wilson remained unusually quiet. She kept watching Sophie, almost waiting. Sure enough, halfway through snack time, Sophie stood up again. Mrs. Wilson immediately stood as well. This time, she decided not to stop her. Instead, she followed from a distance. Sophie slowly crossed the classroom, walked past the reading corner, past the toy kitchen, past the art supplies. She finally stopped beside little Emma. Emma hadn't touched her food. Her head rested quietly on the table. The other children continued eating. Neither teacher had noticed. Sophie gently patted Emma's arm. Emma lifted her head. Her face looked pale. Miss Carter immediately hurried over. "Emma," the little girl whispered, "my tummy hurts." Within moments, the office called Emma's mother to pick her up. As the teachers comforted Emma, Mrs. Wilson quietly looked toward Sophie. The little girl had already returned to her own chair. She was happily feeding tiny cracker pieces to Mr. Teddy, as though nothing unusual had happened. That afternoon, another parent arrived early, Mrs. Jenkins, Emma's grandmother. She thanked Miss Carter for noticing Emma wasn't feeling well. Miss Carter smiled politely, but before she could answer, Mrs. Wilson spoke. "It wasn't actually us." Mrs. Jenkins looked confused. Mrs. Wilson glanced across the room. It was Sophie. Mrs. Jenkins followed her eyes. The little girl was sitting on the floor, carefully placing puzzle pieces together. She looked exactly like every other 2-year-old. Mrs. Jenkins smiled. "Well, please tell her thank you." Mrs. Wilson nodded. But something about those words stayed with her. Thank you. When was the last time anyone had thanked Sophie? Almost every conversation about her had been about correcting her, redirecting her, reporting her, documenting another problem. Not once had anyone stopped to ask what she had actually been trying to do. By Friday afternoon, Mrs. Wilson reopened Sophie's folder. She slowly turned each page, one report after another, left her seat, walked away, ignored instructions, separated from the group. The words suddenly felt different. Not because the reports had changed, because her perspective had. She closed the folder and looked toward the security monitor mounted high on the office wall. Miss Carter noticed. Quietly she asked, "Would you like to see the recordings?" Mrs. Wilson hesitated. "I've watched parts of them before." "I know," Miss Carter replied softly. But we've always watched them to see what Sophie did wrong. She paused. What if this time? We watched to see what she was trying to do. Mrs. Wilson looked back at the monitor. For the first time all week, she wasn't looking for another mistake. She was looking for an answer. Without another word, she reached for the remote. The security footage from Monday morning appeared on the screen. Neither woman realized. They were about to discover something that had been happening right in front of them for months. Mrs. Wilson pressed the play button. The security recording began with an ordinary Monday morning. Parents hurried through the front doors carrying backpacks and lunchboxes. Children laughed as they ran toward their classrooms. Nothing looked unusual. Miss Carter increased the playback speed until the children settled onto the reading rug. There, she said quietly. Watch Sophie. Mrs. Wilson folded her arms. The video showed Sophie sitting exactly where she was supposed to be. Mr. Teddy rested comfortably in her lap. She listened as Miss Carter began reading. Then, just like every report described, Sophie stood up. There, Mrs. Wilson whispered. That's where she leaves. Miss Carter nodded. But don't watch Sophie. Mrs. Wilson frowned. What? Watch everyone else. Mrs. Wilson leaned closer to the monitor. At first, nothing seemed different. Children listened to the story. Miss Carter turned another page. Everything appeared perfectly normal. Then, tucked behind the bookshelf, almost completely hidden from the teacher's view, little Noah quietly wiped tears from his face. He wasn't crying loudly. He wasn't asking for help. He simply sat alone, trying not to be noticed. Sophie looked directly toward him. She walked over without hesitation. She never spoke. She simply placed Mr. Teddy in Noah's lap. The little boy hugged the teddy bear tightly. Within seconds, his crying stopped. Mrs. Wilson stared at the screen. She replayed the same 10 seconds. Again. Then again. Each time she noticed something new. Not once had Sophie looked at the toys. Not once had she tried to play. She had walked straight to Noah, almost as if she had known he needed someone. Mrs. Wilson slowly looked down at Monday's report. Left story time without permission. That was all it said. Nothing about Noah. Nothing about the tears. Nothing about the teddy bear. Miss Carter spoke softly. The report wasn't wrong. Mrs. Wilson nodded. It just wasn't complete. Miss Carter fast-forwarded to Tuesday. This was the day Sophie left during art class. Mrs. Wilson remembered it clearly. She had written another report herself. The video began. Children painted happily, while teachers walked around the room helping them. A few minutes passed. Then Sophie quietly stood up. Mrs. Wilson instinctively reached for her notebook before stopping herself. She watched carefully. Instead of walking toward the toys, Sophie walked into the hallway. She stopped outside the toddler classroom, exactly where Miss Carter had found her. The two women watched in silence. Inside the toddler room, a little girl accidentally dropped her stuffed bunny behind a heavy storage shelf. The bunny slid completely out of reach. The little girl looked around helplessly. Her lip began to tremble. She started crying. The teacher inside the room was helping another child put on a shoe and hadn't noticed. Sophie stood quietly outside the door. She pressed one tiny hand against the glass. Then she pointed. Again and again. Only after another teacher walked past did anyone notice the crying child. The stuffed bunny was retrieved. The tears stopped. Sophie smiled, then calmly walked back toward her classroom. She hadn't entered the room. She hadn't broken any rules. She had simply noticed something before everyone else. Mrs. Wilson slowly lowered the remote. I remember writing that report. So do I, Miss Carter answered. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Wednesday's recording began. Mrs. Wilson almost skipped it, but Miss Carter shook her head. This one matters. The classroom appeared on the screen. Children were building towers with colorful blocks. Lucas accidentally knocked Noah's tower over. The blocks scattered everywhere. Noah burst into tears. Both teachers were helping other children. Before either adult reacted, Sophie crossed the room. She knelt beside Noah. She quietly handed him the first block. Then another. Then another. Noah stopped crying before either teacher reached him. Mrs. Wilson smiled faintly. I remember thinking she had wandered away again. Miss Carter nodded. We never realized she was always walking toward someone. Mrs. Wilson replayed the clip. This time she didn't watch Sophie. She watched the classroom. Something caught her attention. Every single child continued playing. None of them had noticed Noah crying. Not one. Only Sophie had. Another clip began. Thursday. Outdoor play. Children laughed as they climbed, slid, and chased bubbles across the playground. According to the report, Sophie had once again wandered away from the group. The camera showed her walking toward the far fence. Mrs. Wilson sighed. This one really worried me. So did me, Miss Carter admitted. They watched carefully. Near the fence stood little Mason. His tiny shoe had become untied. He kept stepping on the lace every time he tried to walk. Sophie slowly walked over. She bent down. She couldn't tie the shoe. She was only 2. Instead, she gently patted Mason's shoulder, then pointed down at his foot. Only then did playground teacher Mrs. Green notice. Oh goodness. She quickly tied Mason's shoe before he tripped. Mrs. Wilson blinked. She hadn't remembered that part at all. She had only remembered Sophie leaving the playground group. Not why. The room felt unusually quiet now. Miss Carter reached for Sophie's folder. She placed it beside the keyboard. Let's compare. Mrs. Wilson opened the folder. Monday. Left story time. Tuesday. Left classroom. Wednesday. Left activity. Thursday. Separated from group. Friday. Left lunch table. Every report described movement. None described purpose. Mrs. Wilson slowly closed the folder. I've spent weeks documenting where Sophie went. She swallowed. I never once asked why she went there. Miss Carter gave a small smile. Neither did the rest of us. Just then, another notification appeared on the security system. Friday's lunch recording. Neither teacher had watched it before. Miss Carter clicked play. Children sat around tiny tables eating sandwiches and apple slices. Everything looked normal. Then Sophie stood. Mrs. Wilson watched without blinking. This time, Sophie walked toward little Emma. Emma quietly lowered her head onto the table. She looked exhausted. No one noticed. Not the teachers, not the children, only Sophie. She gently touched Emma's arm. Emma slowly looked up. Seconds later, Miss Carter noticed Emma looked pale and immediately called the office, watching it from above. Mrs. Wilson finally understood something she hadn't seen all week. Sophie wasn't wandering aimlessly. She wasn't ignoring instructions. She wasn't trying to be difficult. She was responding to things the adults simply hadn't noticed yet. Mrs. Wilson leaned back in her chair. For a long moment, she couldn't say anything. Then she whispered something Miss Carter never expected to hear. I think, she looked toward Sophie's folder. I think we've been telling the wrong story. Miss Carter looked at her. What do you mean? Mrs. Wilson gently placed one hand on the folder. We've spent an entire week collecting evidence that Sophie couldn't follow rules. She paused. But these cameras tell a completely different story. She looked back at the monitor one last time. The real question isn't why Sophie keeps leaving. She took a slow breath. The real question is, what is she seeing that the rest of us keep missing? The answer to that question would change not only Sophie's future at Little Oaks Daycare, it would change the way every teacher in the building looked at children from that day forward. Mrs. Wilson couldn't stop thinking about one question. What was Sophie seeing that everyone else kept missed? For the first time since Sophie enrolled at Little Oaks Daycare, she decided to do something different. Instead of reviewing incident reports, she reviewed an entire month of security footage. Miss Carter pulled up recordings from 4 weeks earlier. Should I start here? Mrs. Wilson nodded. Let's see if this has always been happening. The video began. It was an ordinary Tuesday morning. Children were arriving with sleepy eyes and tiny backpacks. Parents kissed their little ones goodbye before rushing off to work. Nothing seemed unusual. Until Sophie walked through the front door. She smiled at everyone like she always did. Then, before even taking off her little backpack, she walked straight toward a boy sitting alone near the cubbies. His name was Ethan. He had started daycare only 2 days earlier. He barely spoke. He missed his mother every morning. Most children were too excited to notice him. Sophie wasn't. She walked over, held out Mr. Teddy, then sat beside him without saying a single word. The little boy looked at her. His crying slowed. Within a minute, he was smiling. Mrs. Wilson leaned back in her chair. "Did anyone see that?" Miss Carter shook her head. "I don't think so." The teachers had been busy welcoming the other children. No one realized that the newest child in daycare had been comforted, not by an adult, but by another 2-year-old. Miss Carter skipped ahead another few days. This time the classroom was preparing for music time. Children danced while tiny instruments filled the room with cheerful noise. Tambourines, toy drums, little maracas. Everyone looked excited, except one child, Emily. She covered her ears. The noise was too much for her. The teachers thought she simply wasn't in the mood. But Sophie noticed something else. She quietly walked across the room, sat beside Emily, then covered her own ears too. Emily looked at Sophie. For the first time all morning, she smiled. Mrs. Wilson whispered, "She wasn't copying Emily." Miss Carter nodded. She was letting Emily know she wasn't alone. Neither woman spoke for several seconds. Another recording began. Outdoor play. Children chased bubbles across the playground. One little boy climbed the play structure. Another little girl dug in the sandbox. Then the camera caught Sophie again. She wandered away from the group. Mrs. Wilson instinctively smiled. A week earlier, she would have reached for another incident report. Now, she simply waited. Sophie stopped beside the playground bench where old Mr. Jenkins sat. Every Wednesday morning, he volunteered to read books to the children. That day, he wasn't reading. He sat quietly staring at the ground. His shoulders looked heavy. His smile was gone. Sophie climbed onto the bench beside him. She didn't say anything. She simply reached into her tiny backpack, pulled out half of her cookie, and placed it in his hand. Mr. Jenkins looked surprised. Then he laughed softly. He broke the cookie in half and gave one piece back to Sophie. The two of them sat together eating cookies while the children played nearby. Mrs. Wilson smiled. "I remember that day, so do I," Miss Carter replied. Mr. Jenkins had just lost his wife. Mrs. Wilson slowly turned toward her. "I never knew. He didn't tell the children." Miss Carter smiled gently. But somehow, Sophie knew he needed someone. Mrs. Wilson looked back at the screen. Not because Sophie had solved anything, not because she understood grief, but because she had noticed something adults were too busy to see. The next video made both women laugh. One rainy afternoon, every child rushed to the window to watch the storm. Lightning flashed, rain poured against the glass. The teachers encouraged everyone to count the thunder together. 1, 2, 3. Then little Liam became frightened. He stepped away from the window and quietly hid beneath a table. The teachers continued leading the counting activity. Only Sophie noticed. She crawled under the table, sat beside Liam, and held out Mr. Teddy. When Miss Carter finally noticed them, both toddlers were smiling. Mrs. Wilson laughed through a tear. "I actually wrote her up for leaving the weather lesson." Miss Carter smiled. And Liam went home telling his mom that Sophie made thunderstorms less scary. Mrs. Wilson looked down. "I never heard that part." Because nobody asked. By now, the stack of incident reports no longer looked like evidence. They looked incomplete. Every page described Sophie's movement. None described her heart. Mrs. Wilson stood up and walked toward the classroom window. Outside, Sophie and the other children were planting tiny flowers in the daycare garden. Most children carefully dug small holes exactly where the teachers instructed. Sophie wasn't planting. She was helping Noah push dirt back into his flower pot after he accidentally knocked it over. Mrs. Wilson smiled. "She's doing it again." Miss Carter looked outside. She smiled too. This time we noticed. Just then there was a gentle knock on the office door. It was Mrs. Anderson, one of the parents. She looked worried. "I'm sorry to interrupt." Mrs. Wilson stood. "Of course. Come in." Mrs. Anderson smiled nervously. "I wanted to thank whoever helped my daughter yesterday." Mrs. Wilson frowned. "What happened?" "My daughter came home talking about Sophie." Mrs. Wilson exchanged a glance with Miss Carter. Mrs. Anderson continued. "Emma has been nervous about daycare lately. She said Sophie always knows when she's sad." Mrs. Wilson remained silent. Mrs. Anderson smiled. "Yesterday Emma told me, when Sophie hugs me, I don't feel scared anymore." The room became very quiet. Mrs. Anderson laughed softly. "I know they're only toddlers, but I just wanted to say thank you." After she left, Mrs. Wilson slowly sat back down. For nearly a minute, she didn't say a word. Finally, she whispered, "We almost asked that little girl to leave." Miss Carter nodded. "We judged her by behavior." Mrs. Wilson looked toward the security monitor, when we should have been paying attention to character. She reached for Sophie's folder one last time. Then something surprised Miss Carter. Instead of opening it, Mrs. Wilson quietly closed it, locked it inside a cabinet, and turned the key. "I don't think we'll be needing this anymore." But there was still one conversation left. One conversation Mrs. Wilson had been expecting all week. A conversation she now realized would be very different from the one she had planned. The phone sat quietly on her desk. She picked it up, not to ask Sophie's parents to come because of a problem, but because there was something they deserved to hear. Mrs. Wilson looked at the phone on her desk for several seconds before dialing Sophie's father. Just 24 hours earlier, she had planned a completely different conversation. She had rehearsed every word in her mind. "Mr. Thompson, I'm afraid we're having difficulty meeting Sophie's needs. We believe another daycare might be a better fit." Those were the words she had expected to say. Now, they felt impossible. The phone rang twice. Then a warm voice answered. "Hello, this is Daniel." "Good afternoon, Mr. Thompson. This is Mrs. Wilson from Little Oaks Daycare." There was a brief pause. "Oh," his voice became quieter. "Is everything all right?" Mrs. Wilson immediately recognized the change in his tone. It was the voice of a parent preparing for bad news. She took a slow breath. "Everything is all right." Another pause. "In fact, I was hoping you and your wife could stop by this afternoon if you have time. Is Sophie okay?" "She's perfectly fine. I'd just like to talk with you." After they ended the call, Mrs. Wilson remained seated. She realized something that made her heart sink. Daniel hadn't sounded surprised. He had sounded worried. Almost as if he had been expecting this phone call. That afternoon, the children laughed outside while parents slowly arrived for pickup. Cars filled the parking lot. Tiny backpacks disappeared onto little shoulders. One by one, the classrooms became quieter. Finally, Daniel and his wife Sarah walked through the front door. Daniel smiled politely, but his hands were clasped tightly together. Sarah held Sophie's tiny pink jacket. Mrs. Wilson greeted them with a gentle smile. "Thank you both for coming." The three adults sat inside the office. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. Finally, Daniel broke the silence. "If Sophie has been causing problems, we're really sorry." Mrs. Wilson looked at him. "You thought this meeting was about her behavior?" Daniel gave a tired smile. "To be honest, we've been expecting it." Mrs. Wilson frowned. "What do you mean?" Sarah looked down at her hands. This isn't the first daycare that struggled to understand Sophie. The room became very quiet. Daniel continued. "Ever since she learned to walk. She's always been this way." Mrs. Wilson leaned forward. "What way?" Daniel smiled softly. "She notices people." Mrs. Wilson didn't speak. Daniel continued. "If someone in the grocery store drops something, she's the first one to pick it up. If another child starts crying at the park, she walks over and sits beside them. If someone looks lonely, she somehow finds them." Sarah smiled through watery eyes. "We've stopped trying to explain it. People usually think she's distracted." Mrs. Wilson slowly looked toward the security monitor. I finally understand." Miss Carter entered the office carrying a small tablet. "I wanted to show you something." She placed it on the desk. One by one, she played the clips. Noah, Emma, Ethan, Liam, the crying toddler, Mr. Jenkins. Every moment, every act of quiet kindness. Neither Daniel nor Sarah looked surprised. Instead, they smiled. Daniel laughed softly. "She still carries Mr. Teddy everywhere." Sarah nodded. "She says he helps people feel brave." Mrs. Wilson blinked. "She told you that?" Sarah smiled. "As much as a 2-year-old can. She hugs Teddy, then gives him to someone who looks sad." Mrs. Wilson suddenly remembered the very first video. Noah, the teddy bear. She looked down at Sophie's incident reports. Every page suddenly felt painfully incomplete. She quietly gathered them into a neat pile. Then she looked at Daniel. "I owe all of you an apology." Daniel shook his head gently. "You were trying to keep the children safe." I understand. Mrs. Wilson sighed. No, I was watching Sophie's feet, when I should have been watching her heart. The following Monday morning, something was different. The children entered the classroom as usual, but hanging beside the reading rug was a brand new bulletin board. Across the top, colorful letters spelled out 4 simple words. The Little Acts of Kindness Wall. Miss Carter smiled at the class. This week, we're going to start noticing kind things. Not just good listening, not just cleanup time, but kindness. The children looked around curiously. Little Lucas raised his hand. What if someone helps a friend? We'll put it on the wall. Emma smiled. What if someone shares? That goes on the wall too. Then Noah asked, what if someone gives you a teddy bear when you're sad? Miss Carter smiled. That definitely belongs on the wall. She reached into a small basket, pulled out the very first paper heart, and pinned it to the bulletin board. It read, Sophie shared Mr. Teddy with a friend who needed comfort. The toddlers clapped, although most of them didn't fully understand why. Sophie looked up at the heart, then looked at Mr. Teddy. She smiled. Not because her name was on the wall, not because everyone was looking at her. She simply hugged her teddy bear, then walked over to little Ethan. He was standing by himself again. Without saying a word, she placed Mr. Teddy into his hands. The room filled with quiet laughter. Mrs. Wilson looked at Miss Carter. You know, I almost sent her away. Miss Carter smiled. I'm glad we watched the cameras. Mrs. Wilson shook her head. So am I. But I think we learned the wrong lesson. Miss Carter looked surprised. What do you mean? Mrs. Wilson watched Sophie from across the classroom. We thought the cameras would show us who Sophie really was. She smiled. They didn't. The cameras showed us who we had been. For a moment, neither woman spoke. They had spent weeks measuring obedience, recording mistakes, counting interruptions. Meanwhile, the smallest child in the building had been quietly teaching kindness every single day. Not with speeches, not with perfect behavior, simply by noticing people who needed someone. Years later, many of the children who attended Little Oaks Daycare would forget the songs they sang. They would forget which toys they played with. They would even forget the names of some of their teachers. But many of them would remember one little girl with a brown teddy bear. The little girl who always seemed to know when someone felt lonely. The little girl who reminded a room full of adults that kindness isn't always loud. Sometimes, kindness quietly gets up, walks across the room, and sits beside someone who needs a friend.